Incident response. So I am a digital forensic examiner at a local computer forensics electronics discovery consulting company. I mainly focus on digital forensics and IR. I'm also an adjunct instructor at U of L, where I teach the computer forensics class as well as the occasional information security course. So I can get this fixed for you. All right. As far as formal education is concerned, I obtained a master's in digital forensics from UCF and then went through the CIS undergrad program at U of L. Hold various certifications in digital forensics and IR. So today we're going to start off talking about just the basics of memory forensics, kind of what it is, why we do it, but really today we're going to focus on the acquisition. So we're not talking a lot about the analysis today, really about the acquisition and how it works, and towards the end of the day, we'll talk a little bit about some of the anti-forensic avenues we see and how malware and rootkits can attempt to undermine what these acquisition tools are doing. Okay, so memory acquisition is simply copying volatile memory from your computer from the target system to a storage medium. So typically that storage medium is going to be a USB device, a network share, something like that. This volatile memory can be from a desktop, laptop, virtual machine, even a mobile device. Today we're not really going to hit on mobile devices, but just know that that is an option, it is a possibility. The main thing here is that memory acquisition, once we obtain this memory dump, this will allow us to later analyze this using a memory forensics tool. So why would we want to do that? Well, memory forensics, as we'll find out, is useful in a variety of cases, whether that's criminal, civil, acceptable use policy, and just internal organizational cases, and obviously incident response and malware investigations. Memory forensics turns out to be critical. So this is going to provide us, the analysis is going to provide us insights into recent system events, things like open files, network connections, running processes and services. Good. We also find that through memory analysis, we may be able to uncover data that is not available anywhere else. So we get into things like encryption keys. If you run into a system that is full disk encrypted, or maybe it has a TrueCrypt volume on that system, or a TrueCrypt container, we may be able to pull those encryption keys out of the memory dump that we obtain and unlock those containers or unlock that full disk encrypted drive. Memory-only chats, and essentially anything that is not stored on the disk but traverses the operating system will be in memory at some point. It's just whether or not we're able to acquire that using our memory acquisition tool. So things like the Windows command line history. I'm sure you guys have seen when you do the up arrow in the Windows command prompt, you can see the previous commands that were typed. That's not logged or stored to the disk normally. That's going to be found in memory, so we can dump that out if we obtain the memory dump and start to do some analysis on it. And finally, decrypted malware. This can become particularly interesting because when you start to get into malware investigations, you'll start to see that a lot of times the malware, the executable as it's stored on disk, is usually encrypted, it's compressed, it's packed, it's made in such a way that you have to do something to it before you can hand it over to your reverse engineering team or further analyze it. And we also see that in some cases, the malware that's running on the system may not even have an executable stored on the disk. It may be memory only. So there's been some recent attacks that have come out where there's not an executable stored on the disk to analyze. So if you shut the power off to the system and just obtain a regular disk image, you're not going to find anything about that there, or you're not going to find the actual executable. The big picture here is, though, memory forensics will help us better understand an event through correlation. So in and of itself, we may not be able to provide the full picture through memory forensics, but when we start to correlate that with disk forensics and network forensics, we can start to get a better idea of what actually happened around a particular compromise or an event. So before I get into this, how many have dumped memory from a system before? So, few of you? Okay. So we'll talk about some of the challenges. I'm sure you guys have faced some of this or maybe thought about it. One of the challenges that we end up seeing here in memory acquisition is that memory is always in a state of flux. So memory is always changing particularly when we are running a software tool on the system to dump memory out, we are not halting everything else that's going on in the system. So we have all of these changes taking place behind the scenes that our memory acquisition tool has to deal with. So that's one challenge that we end up seeing. We also end up seeing that the acquisition tool will, in many cases, and this is specific to any type of acquisition tool you're running, is running in a compromised environment or may well be running in a compromised environment. So if you are doing a memory acquisition, chances are you suspect something is going on with that system, whether you suspect a malware infection or whatever the case is, you think something may be going on. So running some of these software tools, we are relying on this operating system that we don't really trust. So if we have a particularly nefarious strain of malware, we have an adversarial actor that is more sophisticated than some others, they may be able to prevent or otherwise alter this data that we're obtaining from memory, from volatile memory. And we'll hit on that towards the end of the presentation today. We also have to deal with the fact that, contrary to traditional forensics, these memory forensic tools are typically going to change the state of the system that we're actually acquiring. So it used to be that you shut off the system, you connect the hard drive to a write blocker so you don't mess with anything on the actual hard drive. Well, in the case of memory forensics, if you're running a software tool in the system, you are going to be creating artifacts as a result of that, both in memory as well as on disk. So that's something we have to deal with and account for in our analysis and reporting. And then finally, this is one that's not hit on as often, but I think is important. When we are doing this memory acquisition process, these tools are operating at a very low level. They're doing low-level functions. They're interacting with the kernel. They are communicating directly with the memory controller in some cases. The point being that these acquisition tools have to behave themselves. If they are poorly written, if they read from a certain area of memory they shouldn't be reading from, which we'll talk about, you can end up crashing the system. Now, best case, you crash the system and you end up with a partial memory dump or maybe no memory dump, but it's just Joe's computer in HR, so it's not a big deal. But if you're running this on a production server or something that can't be taken down, now you're forced to shut down the system, reboot, and that has a whole lot of problems that could go along with it. So our acquisition tool must behave. And so the options that we're going to talk about today, and with regard to the actual acquisition, we have hardware options. So we'll start off with this. This is going to be using a hardware device, typically a PCI Express card, or a FireWire port, to dump memory using DMA. We also have software options. This is the more common approach in my experience. This is running a tool on the target system to dump memory out to a USB device, a network storage device, something like that. And then finally, we have kind of alternative or hybrid approaches that I've collectively grouped into an other category. So these are options like VMware or virtual machine suspension. We'll look at crash dumps and hibernation files. And then I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the cold boot attack. We'll talk about that as well. So memory acquisition via hardware, as I mentioned, this typically takes place using a PCI Express card or via FireWire. And essentially what these methods are doing is using direct memory access, or DMA, to communicate directly with the controller. So the memory controller. So you're bypassing the CPU, bypassing the operating system, and dumping the memory directly out via the memory bus. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages with this approach. The biggest advantage that's brought up often is that malware or rootkits can't really mess with this approach. And that's not entirely true. I don't really have time to get into the details of how it could be thwarted. We'll focus on the software side of anti-forensics. But in general, a hardware acquisition is going to be a little bit more resilient to manipulation by rootkits. So this hardware acquisitions do not require the operating system functionality. So they're not issuing kernel functions. They're not utilizing these APIs that Windows makes available. Instead, they're communicating directly with the memory controller. So this, in turn, makes it more difficult for malware to thwart, because now we're not relying necessarily on the operating system that we don't trust. And we also see that there's a smaller footprint left behind by this. And in general, with forensics, you're going to want to minimize your footprint. So in this case, you're doing just that. So this sounds great at this point. It sounds like this would certainly be the way we'd want to go. But there's disadvantages associated with hardware acquisitions as well. And one of the huge ones that jumps right out is that if you're using a PCI Express card as your acquisition utility or as your acquisition tool, you typically are going to have to install this thing prior to acquisition. So, which means if you have a machine that you want to acquire, are you really going to shut down the system, install your PCI Express card, and then turn it back on? Probably not. And in fact, this is not really the intention. So these PCI Express cards are not really designed for a first responder, incident responder scenario. Instead, they're typically designed so that you identify your most high-risk systems, the systems that are most likely to be compromised that you would need to acquire memory from. Then at some point, you install these PCI cards so that you have them, in the event that you need to dump memory. But that's certainly a disadvantage. We'll also see that some hardware approaches can only access the lower 4 gigabytes of RAM. So how many have a system, your personal system has less than 4 gigabytes of RAM? Does anyone have a system like that? Nobody. So that shows you that this is becoming increasingly more of a problem with older, maybe XP systems, older systems, virtual machines maybe. You may encounter this. But in general, computers that you buy from Best Buy are coming out of the box with more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. So that's a big problem. And then less on the technical side and more just from a budgetary standpoint, these commercial options end up being costly. There are not a lot of options in this space. So looking at just the PCI options, we're talking multi-$1,000 per card. So if you're trying to deploy this in any type of scale, that becomes quite a costly endeavor. All right, so let's look at some of these actual products here for acquisition via hardware. And these are the PCI PCI Express or Express card options. Printable here at the top right is a proof of concept tool. To my knowledge, it's not widely available. This is not a new tool. Has anyone heard of this before? This was a 2004-ish tool written or designed by Joe Grand and Brian Carrier. And essentially, it's a large PCI card you attach to your target system. It will communicate directly with your memory controller and dump the memory out. Once a switch is activated externally, it'll dump the memory out via a debug port or via a serial port. So again, this is not widely available, but it was something that was put out there way back. The only widely available tool I know of in this space, and someone definitely correct me if I'm wrong here, is made by Windows Scope. So it's called Capture Guard. They have a PCI Express and Express card option. You can go to Windows Scope, I think it's windowscope.com actually, and find out a lot more information about these. But they come with the same limitations the PCI Express card does. Comes with the same limitations as far as installing the card. If you have the Express card option, you may be able to get around that. But the point here is that there are limited options with regard to hardware acquisitions. We also see that we can acquire memory using FireWire. And essentially this approach exploits the fact that a device connected via hardware can communicate directly with the memory controller using DMA. So this allows us to circumvent the operating system and dump memory via the FireWire port. So one scenario where you may see this used is you have your acquisition computer and you have your target computer. They're both connected via FireWire. You're running some type of specialized acquisition tool on your acquisition computer. It communicates directly with your target system's RAM over FireWire and dumps it back to your acquisition system. So that's one scenario where you may see it. Obviously, this is going to require a FireWire port or an Express card that has a FireWire port on it. That's becoming increasingly less common. I don't know, in my experience, you see FireWire on older systems, but on the newer systems, it's not nearly as common as we used to see it. Then we also have the whole 4 gigabyte problem. Okay, so this is actually a result of the addressing scheme used in FireWire and the actual protocol that limits you to only 4 gigabytes of RAM that you can capture. We'll also see that there's certain areas of memory you need to avoid if you're reading memory over the FireWire port. So reading from those systems can end up crashing or freezing your target system, which is obviously not ideal. So the point is we have some hardware options out there. They're somewhat limited, and there's definitely some disadvantages to them, but they're out there. In my experience, the more common approach here is using software, running a tool on your target system to dump memory out to a USB device, to a network storage device, or something like that. There's a lot of options in this space, particularly when you compare it to the hardware options, but they're not all equal. So we'll look at what these tools are actually doing. And the reason it's important to understand what's going on here kind of behind the scenes is that this helps you to understand how rootkits can begin to undermine this process. And obviously we know we're relying on the operating system, but this gives us some more detail as to what these tools are actually doing. So for those of you who have acquired memory and dumped memory before, have you guys looked into what's actually going on behind the scenes as far as what different methods these acquisition tools are using? So it's not, well, it can be fun work, but the point is they're not all doing it the same way. So when we start to look at what these tools are actually doing, there is a section object Windows makes available called the whack device whack physical memory. So this is basically the operating system or the Windows Memory Manager's view of physical memory. So this is what the operating system can see. It says here's the RAM available for use to process anything running on the system. So generally, your acquisition tools will attempt to map sections of this object and then read that out and write it to a separate file called your memory dump. So the majority of them utilize this physical memory object. Now, prior to Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 1, this object was actually able to be accessed from user mode, meaning any program running in user mode had free reign to this physical memory object. So clearly, for any developers out there, you know that this could be a huge security issue. So that was changed, luckily. Now, in order to interact with this device, we have to be running in kernel mode. So for that reason, for those of you who have run acquisition tools, you've probably noticed that your tool loads a device driver into kernel mode. And the reason it loads that device driver, one of the reasons, is so they can interact with this physical memory object, because otherwise you can't do a lot with it. We'll also see that some tools will use a kernel function to map this memory more directly. So they'll go around this physical memory object and map this memory directly. So if we were going to narrow down how these acquisition tools are working and put that into a couple of steps, essentially they are mapping portions of the physical address space into their virtual address space, and they're then reading portions of that out to a separate file. We'll also see that reading from certain areas of the physical address space, called the direct memory access or DMA regions, can become dangerous and end up crashing the system. So I hit on that a little bit earlier about having your tools have to behave while they're doing their functions, and this is one reason. So if we were to kind of just a simplified graphic of the physical address space in a Windows system, this is something we might see. So notice here that the blue blocks here, the RAM, this is what your operating system sees. This is what is available for use. But there's other sections interleaved here that are reserved for other operations. So these could be reserved for things like PCI device memory. These could be reserved for other motherboard components. Or they could be reserved for the actual firmware code and data running on your system. Now, most acquisition tools, when they are dumping your memory, they're only looking at these blue sections here. They're only going to read these RAM sections, what's available for use to the operating system. Now, one of the reasons there is that reading from these red sections, from these reserved sections, can be dangerous, right? So if we're reading from a section that ends up being directly mapped to a PCI device instead of being actually in system memory, you can end up changing values and crashing the system. If you're changing registers on the directly mapped PCI components. However, what's important here is that if you need to analyze firmware, or you believe you have a firmware-based rootkit, you need to have a tool that can actually identify which of these red areas, which of these reserved areas is containing your firmware code and data, and be able to dump that out. Because as I mentioned, most acquisition tools, most software acquisition tools out there will not acquire the firmware. So we've seen that now there's actually malware out there in the wild that is persistent via the BIOS. So we have to be able to have some way to access these reserved sections that contain the firmware code. And that's one thing to consider when you look at your software tools. So, as I mentioned, most software tools will use kernel functions to interact with memory and be able to dump this. I'm not going to go into what each one of these means. If you're interested, you can look them up. They're all on the TechNet website, I believe. But essentially, they're using a number of kernel functions to figure out which areas of memory they need to map and which areas of memory they need to dump. All of their functions are carried out using these kernel APIs that are provided by the operating system. So what I'd like you to think about is what happens if these functions are hooked? And for anyone that is maybe unfamiliar with the concept of hooking, you can essentially think of it as a redirect. So you are trying to call, if a function is hooked and you try to call it, what may end up happening is there is a different function that's actually run, usually a modified version of that. So we see this oftentimes in malware cases where if the malware wants to hide itself from a directory listing, instead of just obviously issuing the hidden bit or changing it to the hidden bit, it may hook certain processes or certain kernel functions in order to hide itself from any type of enumeration that your sysadmin is doing. We'll also see this hooking in anti-forensics with regard to the actual acquisition process here. So when we're looking at software tools, there are a number of things to consider when you're trying to pick out which tool is right for your environment. Obviously, operating system support is paramount here. Your acquisition tool needs to support the operating system from which you're trying to dump memory. So Linux versus OS X versus Windows, and then even within that, you need to see, okay, is it Windows XP, Windows 7, Server, 32 versus 64-bit, and so on. This all becomes important due to some of the changes that are introduced in new operating systems. Believe it or not, some acquisition tools require you to install them. So clearly this is not going to be ideal. If you have to install a program prior to acquiring memory, this is creating a bigger footprint in both memory as well as on disk. So generally this is not going to be an approach you want to take. It's important to see which functions of your acquisition tool are operating in user mode versus kernel mode. We'll talk about a proof of concept tool towards the end of the presentation that exploits the fact that many acquisition tools are opening the handle to and writing to this memory dump in user mode. So in general, if your tool operates more in kernel mode, it's going to be more protected from some of this manipulation by malware. The memory footprint your tool leaves behind is clearly important here. We want to leave the smallest footprint we can. Some tools you'll find support the page file and map file, so if we have the ability to obtain those two things as we're acquiring memory, that can be great on the analysis side. So as you guys probably know, some virtual memory may be swapped out to the page file and stored on disk. Some tools actually don't even capture the page file. So anything that's stored on the page file, you may just have a missing hole essentially in your memory dump when you go to actually acquire it. It's also important, and this is overlooked sometimes, to see whether or not your tool is actively maintained. Obviously, this is important from the scope of new operating systems coming out. You want your tool to be able to dump memory from those operating systems. But it's also important when you start to look at the anti-forensic side of the coin. So there's constantly developments on the anti-forensic side that ideally you want your tool developers to know about and to be up to date on so that they can either patch their acquisition tools or they can at least inform you or have something in there about the weaknesses of this tool. So it's important to know that. And then you've also got some maybe not top tier considerations, but things that could make a difference depending on your environment. So the ability to capture those reserved sections that I just mentioned. If you need to access firmware, if you're doing some type of firmware analysis, you need to make sure your acquisition tool is dumping that. Some tools have a different method for mapping physical memory, so that may become important. encryption and compression of the data as it's written, as it's read from memory in the buffer and before it actually goes to your memory dump. And then, of course, the output format. So some tools will store the memory dump in a proprietary format. A lot of this becomes more important depending on what analysis tool you're using. Some of the tools out there available, you'll see that, I mean, this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is some of the more popular acquisition tools for memory. You have free or open source and/or open source, and then some commercial tools. Windows Scope actually has a software acquisition utility as well. Some of these are GUI, some of these are command line. I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail. I would encourage you to take a look at some of these if you're interested. Particularly WinPMem is constantly changing, constantly developing. It's written by a couple of guys, or a few guys at Google in the Recall project. Has anyone used Recall before? So you guys are probably familiar with WinPMem. That's a great one to look at. A few screenshots here. As you can see, they're very basic interfaces, right? So this is nothing, I mean, these are generally intended for first responders, people that may not have a in-depth technical background. They just need to go on site, connect something to a computer, and click go, or as many or as few keystrokes as possible. So a lot of these are pretty straightforward to run. Okay, so moving into the other category, and these are kind of hybrid approaches to acquiring memory. The first is going to be virtual machine acquisition. If your target system is a virtual machine, your life may have gotten a little bit easier because instead of having to run a software or hardware tool, a lot of times you can simply issue a suspend or a snapshot operation on that virtual machine to save the virtual machine memory to the host hard drive. So this is an easy approach to take. Some products will create raw memory dumps, some save in a proprietary format. So if you're using VirtualBox, it's a little bit different format than VMware, for example. But the point is you can issue these common commands to save out a memory dump without having to run a separate tool. The problem here is that in some cases, the network connections or other portions may be left out of here. So VMware, for example, whenever you issue a suspend operation, actually runs a batch script in the background that closes all of your TCP and UDP connections, frees up the IP address, and then goes forward with the suspend. So you may not find active network connections in a memory dump that you create through a suspend operation. So if network connections are important, you may want to take a different approach, such as running a software acquisition utility directly on the virtual machine. Okay, crash dumps are interesting. I'm sure everyone in the room has seen the blue screen of death at some point. So this is the old school blue screen of death. It's not the friendly one that you see now with the sad face or whatever it is. So this is the old school one. But basically, what is happening here, whenever a crash dump is created, and you guys may well know this, there is a dump file being written in the background to the host hard drive typically. And the dump file could be a mini or small dump, it could be a kernel dump, or it could be a, quote, complete dump. And this is just based on the settings that you have to determine which type of dump you want to create in the event of a system crash. So one way that you could acquire memory if you really wanted to is to force a blue screen of death, and then you, if the complete blue screen or complete crash dump is enabled, then you're writing a complete crash dump, you're writing a memory image or memory dump to the actual host hard drive. Now, clearly this is not ideal, right? So you're dumping, you're creating new files on the host hard drive, you're crashing the system. That's not typically an approach we want to take. Where crash dumps become interesting is when you're looking at disk forensics and you come across one of these crash dumps. So if a system blue screened in the past and a crash dump is created, whenever you create a forensic image with that hard drive and you're looking through, if you come across a crash dump and it's complete, you may well be able to feed that into your analysis tool and start running analysis on it as if you had acquired memory on the date that the crash dump was created. So crash dumps are not really something that I see being used by a first responder. It's more useful in disk forensics and after the fact host-based forensics. Okay. Hibernation files are similar in that. So Hibernation file is a compressed file that is written to your hard drive whenever the system enters hibernation mode. Okay, so this is not a complete memory image, but it will contain a lot of information that's useful during memory forensics. So essentially this will contain enough information the system needs in order to resume what it was doing whenever it was hibernated. So running processes and that kind of thing will be included here. And the good thing about hibernation files is that we can feed them directly into, well, prior to the new format in later versions of Windows, we can feed them into memory forensic analysis tools and be able to analyze those hibernation files as if it was an acquired memory dump. So just like we use crash dumps in disk forensics, we can do the same thing with hibernation files. There are certain portions, such as network connections and other things, that are not included in hibernation files that you need to be aware of. It's not really something we can change, but it's something to be aware of. If you don't see a network connection in hibernation file, it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't one before the hibernation file was created. So the big thing here is that this will allow an examiner, or may allow an examiner, to see the state of the system at some point in the past through disk forensics. And then when you incorporate things like volume shadow copies, that each will include a different hibernation file, then it becomes really interesting. And then finally we have cold boot attacks. Everyone heard of cold boot attacks? There's a lot of research out there about it. This slide is included more out of completeness than practicality. So basically the cold boot attack is exploiting the fact that whenever you shut down your system, the memory on your actual RAM chips is not immediately lost. So it turns out that with older versions, DDR1, DDR2, if you cool those down using an upside down compressed air container, or put it in a freezer, do something to cool those RAM chips down to a very low temperature, the data actually stays around on those a little bit longer than it would if it was just sitting out at room temperature. So what these researchers have found is that you could actually transplant RAM from one system to another, assuming you cool it down to a very low temperature, transplant it to another system, and dump memory from the original system. So this was cool. It's great. There is a lot of research out there about it. In fact, there is a paper all about the practicality of this approach. So there was a paper by Grun and Mueller that found that on DDR1, DDR2 RAM, the cold boot attack worked. They could reproduce it, but they could not reproduce this on DDR3. I have not personally gone through a cold boot attack, so I can't say personally if this works on any version of RAM. In my experience, this is not what at least private sector consultants are doing to acquire memory. There's a lot better approaches, easier approaches than a cold boot attack. I can't speak for government agencies, but I can tell you that there are other approaches out there that are easier and perhaps more reliable. But this is an option, and I wanted to include it here. Okay, so we're going to wrap up talking about potential anti-forensic avenues. And we're really going to focus here on the software acquisition process because this is the most common way to acquire memory, running a tool on the system to dump memory out. So there are a couple of ways that tools can do this, that malware can do this. The first, and these are very general, the first is to block the acquisition altogether. And the second, and a little bit more nefarious in my opinion, is to corrupt or otherwise alter the data that is actually being acquired by the tool. And we'll look at each one of these here in just a minute. So this isn't the extent of what we're talking about. And again, this generally applies to software acquisition utilities. If you zone out in the next couple of slides and don't retain any of that, essentially what you need to know is that these these approaches are taking advantage of the fact that our tools are relying on functions made available by the operating system. We are forced to some degree to trust the operating system from which we're trying to acquire memory, which in the concept of memory forensics and incident response, we don't like having to trust the operating system, but it's something that if we're running software on it, we kind of inherently do. So that's what these tools are taking advantage of. So if we look at blocking the acquisition altogether, there are various ways you could do this. These are 3 different ways. So I talked about hooking earlier, basically redirecting a function to do something other than what it is intended to do. So one option here is to hook one of the common kernel APIs that's used to obtain a map of the physical address space. So you could hook this get physical memory ranges to return null or to return something that's not right. And what may happen is a number of things, depending on how your acquisition tool handles this error. It could just error out. The actual acquisition tool could freeze. Perhaps the system could, depending on what your acquisition tool does, it could actually freeze the system, crash the system. But essentially, whenever your tool says, hey, I need a map of the physical address space, I need to know what's RAM, what's DMA regions, and so on, if you just block that call altogether, then your tool doesn't know what to do, and it stops at that point. So it really depends on how well the acquisition tool is written as to whether it freezes the system or it has a more silent fail. So that's one option, and it turns out that hooking this get physical memory ranges is actually fairly stable, and research has shown that this is a kernel API that is not really used by legitimate drivers, and this is a theme that we'll see here. So if you have your memory acquisition tools, the drivers from your memory acquisition tools, if they are using these exotic and undocumented kernel APIs, then from the malware perspective, if you see a call to that API, then the chances are it's probably not anything other than a memory acquisition tool, right? So it's not like we're using the same kernel APIs that everything else running on the system is using. If we're only seeing acquisition utilities using these exotic APIs, then we may be able to easily identify which of these drivers running on the system is associated with your acquisition tool. So if you just hook this, the bottom line is you may not affect system utilities very much because nothing really relies on this other than acquisition utilities. You can also look at hooking one of these 3 functions, and with the exception of this last one, the map memory dump MD1, this can become a little bit more dangerous dangerous from the rootkit malware perspective, because now if you're hooking some of these functions, the ZW map VF section, map IO space, now you're getting into functions that regular legitimate drivers are using. So if you're messing with these, then you will end up, or you may end up, messing with legitimate drivers and destabilizing the system. So that becomes a lot more dangerous because you can't say that just acquisition tools are utilizing this kernel API. So that's not as easy to pull off as some of the others. We also see that you can destroy a data structure that some of these memory acquisition tools are utilizing in order to dump RAM. So in some cases, if you destroy this owner tag, you may be able to stop the acquisition altogether. So the downside to this approach is that as a first responder, incident responder, whoever is sitting at the computer, if you block the acquisition altogether, they probably know something's up, right? So they might know that, okay, my acquisition tool froze, it crashed. They may not know that, depending on their technical level, they may not know that something nefarious is going on, but it's something where they can document. That something bad happened or that they weren't able to obtain the memory dump. Okay, so this tips off the incident responder, first responder a little bit more than the second approach, which is to actually corrupt or otherwise alter the data that's being acquired. So this gets a little scary here. There are different ways to do this. There's a couple of different ways. Primarily, you can corrupt or alter the data that's acquired by the memory tool. The first is before it's actually even written to the buffer. So has anyone heard of ShadowWalker? So this was a tool. This is actually not a new tool at all. I believe this was 2005 Blockhead. So 10 years. It's pretty crazy. But this is a proof of concept tool that was developed. And basically what this does is return false pages to your memory acquisition tool. So your tool will say, hey, I need to map pages XYZ. And if you have ShadowWalker or something like that, then what it was doing is returning pages with random data and saying, okay, sure, here you go, here's the pages. To the incident responder, to the person sitting there, you won't necessarily know that anything's going on because you're issuing the equivalent of a read file, something like that, or the equivalent of it. You're issuing a read command, you're receiving data back, and you're writing that to the memory dump. There's no error necessarily, there's no crashing, freezing. Your memory dump is created. So in this case, what the authors use, and there's a whole presentation out there about this. There's subsequent research about ShadowWalker. I think there's actually quite a bit out there about this. But this actually used what's known as translation look-aside buffer desynchronization, or TLB desynchronization. Won't get into TLBs and that kind of thing, but this is a really it's a novel approach. It was very interesting. It was something that affected memory acquisition tools on a wide scale. The other thing that a rootkit may be able to do is to alter the data before it is written to the image. So now, as opposed to something like ShadowWalker, we are able to read the pages that we're trying to read, we're able to map them, and then whenever we go to actually write that data to our memory dump, there is something sitting in between there saying, okay, before you write that to the memory dump, let me check to see if there's anything I'm trying to hide in that data you're writing. And if there is, then I'm going to filter that out. So there was a proof of concept tool, and this was a little bit more recent in 2012, called Dementia. This was, I think it was another Black Hat. Actually, this may not have been Black Hat, but this is another tool that was put out there to show that you can mess with the actual data that is being acquired. Dementia, one of the things that this thing did was it leveraged the fact that many tools open the handle to the memory dump that they're writing to, and they write to that memory dump in user mode. So despite the fact that they have a device driver loaded in kernel mode and they are running kernel APIs, ultimately they are transferring that data back to user mode and writing it to their memory dump using common APIs. So what Dementia found was, well, okay, I can run a program in user mode, hook these user mode functions without having kernel access, and clean data as it's being written to a memory dump. So this basically looked to see, is there a memory acquisition tool running on the system? If so, let me make sure I clean up this data before it's written to the dump. So this was a very interesting piece of work put out. Again, both of these are proof of concepts at this point. Not to say that they're not in the wild, but these two, ShadowWalker and Dementia, were proof of concepts. And then finally there was another one that doesn't necessarily directly affect the acquisition. It's just interesting. This was 2014. There was a tool called Attention Deficit Disorder that basically plants fake evidence. So this was interesting in that it was putting in fake processes, maybe fake file handles. And what this is intended to do is to mess with the person actually analyzing this. So if you see that there is an open file handle to something that looks very much like illegal material, then that would be bad for the person that actually had that computer. So there's a lot of other examples there of putting in fake processes that look to be associated with malware and so on. This doesn't really affect the acquisition, but it will definitely affect the analysis. And the problem, as I mentioned, with this approach is that this is more difficult to notice. As the first responder, incident responder, you're likely not going to receive some type of error message that says, whatever data is being changed. You're not going to have the system freezing or your acquisition tool freezing. Instead, you'll end up with having a memory dump that doesn't contain the data you expected to have. Okay, so what can we do? Luckily, there are a couple of tools that are trying to cope with this. And the bottom line here, without getting into exactly what these tools are doing is, from a high level, they are trying to avoid using kernel functions known to be associated with memory acquisition utilities. So as I mentioned earlier, if malware hooks some of these exotic APIs that nothing other than memory acquisition drivers are using, then it's easy for a rootkit to just hook that and not affect the overall state of the system. But if you have acquisition tools that are using the same APIs as everything else, then it becomes harder for, you can't necessarily, as a malware author, you can't hook those APIs, because then you're going to destabilize the system and nothing works. And that's clearly not what you want. So if using more common kernel APIs allows acquisition utilities to kind of hide in plain sight, and not allow malware authors and rootkits to pick out these acquisition utilities from everything else that's happening on the system. So in general, the less we rely on the operating system, and in particular these exotic kernel APIs, the better off we are. Keeping up with the advances in anti-forensics helps as well, particularly if your tool developer is keeping up with advances in anti-forensics, or if they're even working on that side and developing a tool to help get around some of those. So that's great. But the more we know about what rootkits and malware authors are trying to do, and just what academia is coming up with in the scope of anti-forensics, the more we can help try to get around that and make sure we acquire what we're trying to acquire with memory. And then finally, what you may find out is that thorough analysis of the memory dump, even if there are certain areas that are scrubbed or changed, may still reveal the presence of a rootkit. So you may not, the rootkit may scrub certain areas, and you may not have certain parts that you wish you had in your memory dump. But that's not to say you can't identify the fact that there was a rootkit running in the first place. So oftentimes there are multiple ways to answer the same question in memory forensics and forensics in general. So you may not have that first option that you go to, but there are other areas, other pointers to this data in memory once you start to analyze this that you may be able to gain access to. So thorough analysis is definitely a friend here. With that, I'll take any questions you guys have. I have some cards up here. All right. Thanks, guys.